The Civil War began in 1861 under the Lincoln administration. The war was fought between the North and the South. Because each group had conflicting advantages, it was expected that the war would end quickly. However, the Civil War was a long, bloody struggle that was not an easy triumph. Before the war, it was not hard to see the differences of the North and the South. The Northern states, or the Union, wanted slavery to be abolished, while the Southern states, or the Confederacy, believed in slavery. The war was also fought over the economy and states' rights. With the election of Abraham Lincoln, the Southern states decided they had to take drastic action in order to protect slavery. On December 20th, 1860, a secession convention met in South Carolina and adopted an ordinance of secession from the Union. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed suit. On February 8, 1861, a constitution for the newly formed Confederate States of America was created. Jefferson Davis was chosen as the president for a 6-year term. The Constitution by which the permanent government of the Confederate States of America was formed on March 11, 1861. All states ratified it and conformed themselves to its requirements without delay. The North was an industrial region that had many advantages during the war. These included their superior navy, larger number of troops, higher population, and better transportation. Their overwhelming financial and industrial reserves were used to create weapons and supplies, which eventually outstripped the South's initial material advantage. The South also possessed a number of advantages against the North. The Confederacy had the best military generals and had a numerous amount of military weapons and supplies. The South also had an unfair advantage because they were fighting a defensive war, which meant they only had to keep the Union from entering the Confederate States to win the Civil War. The nation faced internal dissent through Copperheads. Copperheads were Northerners who opposed the war and wanted the nation to reunite. Many people viewed them as traitors. Before the war, Lincoln passed the Homestead Act that encouraged citizens to move west so that the South could not claim the land. It encouraged westward migration by providing 160 acres of land to settlers. On April 12th, Confederate forces, led by General Beauregard, opened fire on Fort Sumner in South Carolina. The Confederacy fired on Union forces for 34 hours straight after the Union stronghold refused to surrender the fort. Due to low ammunition, the Union was forced to surrender the fort the following day and evacuated. This was the beginning of the war. This was the first time troops protected themselves by using trenches and barricades. This new tactic inflicted a very high casualty rate. The idea of attrition was also proposed. Attrition was the wearing down of one side by the opponent through exhaustion of soldiers and resources. This caused the replacement of men by both armies. The North's strategy consisted of the Anaconda Plan, which was proposed by Winfield Scott. The Union would blockade Confederate ports and send gunboats down the Mississippi River to divide the Confederacy. The separated South would gradually run out of supplies and surrender. The North believed this would prevail, but it would be a lengthy endeavor. An example of the Anaconda Plan occurred at the Siege of Vicksburg. In May 1863, Ulysses S. Grant's Union armies congregated at Vicksburg. They entrapped the Confederate army under General Pemberton. On July 4th, Vicksburg surrendered after a prolonged siege operations. With the loss of Pemberton's armies, the Confederacy was effectively split in half. Sherman's march to the sea was led by General Sherman. It began on November 15, 1864, in Atlanta, Georgia. Sherman led his crew throughout the South to destroy infrastructure, property, and industries in major cities. His campaign ended in Savannah, Georgia, on December 24, 1864. The South's strategy was diverse. Jefferson Davis believed that if the South waged a defensive war of attrition, then the Union would be forced to spend resources and would tire of the war and negotiate. But this idea of defensive attrition outraged Southerners. The opposal of this called Southerners to be offensive. Under General Robert E. Lee, the Army charged enemy lines and suffered high death rates. Democrats opposed the end of slavery. Republicans were divided on the topic. On September 20, 1862, President Lincoln announced the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared the freedom of all enslaved persons in states that were a part of the Confederacy. The Emancipation also allowed African Americans to enlist in Union forces. Thousands of African Americans rushed to join the military. Over 180,000 African Americans served in the Union Army during the Civil War. The 54th Massachusetts was among the first African American regiment to fight in the Civil War. By serving, African Americans showed that they could fight as well as white soldiers and also helped them overcome discrimination. The North won the Civil War on April 9, 1865, after General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. After 4 years, the war was finally over. This victory ended enslavement of African Americans and strengthened the power of the federal government over the states. At the end of the Civil War, over 620,000 men had been killed, along with 37,000 African American soldiers that lost their lives fighting for their freedom. The economy of the South was devastated. Most of Richmond, Charleston, Atlanta, Mobile, and Vicksburg lay in ruins. The countryside which armies had passed through was littered with the guttered plantation houses and barns, uprooted rail lines, and burned bridges. Crops were destroyed or confiscated, and much livestock lay dead. The Civil War had many consequences and effects. The nation was reunited and the southern states were not allowed to secede. The federal government was supreme over the states, slavery was officially ended, and Reconstruction of America began.